Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents, Gabriel and Teresina Capone. The family lived in a modest home, striving for a better life in America, but young Al quickly veered from the path his parents had hoped for. Though he attended a Catholic school, he struggled with discipline and was expelled at 14 for hitting a teacher. Without formal education, the streets became his classroom. He fell in with local gangs, drawn to their power and the promise of easy money. Among them was the notorious Five Points Gang, where he worked under Frankie Yale, a feared and respected gangster who ran illicit businesses across New York. Capone started as a low-level enforcer, working in Yale's saloons and brothels, where he learned the brutal realities of the underworld. One fateful night in a bar fight, he insulted the sister of a local gangster and paid the price, a razor slash across his face that would earn him the infamous nickname Scarface. Unlike the tough persona he projected, he hated the name, preferring to be called Big Al or Snorky among close friends. In 1919, Johnny Torrio, a rising figure in organized crime, saw potential in the ambitious young thug and invited him to Chicago. This city, already corrupt and violent, would become Capone's empire. Leaving behind his Brooklyn roots, Al Capone boarded a train, unaware that he was on a one-way journey to becoming America's most feared and legendary gangster. Chicago in the early 1920s was a city ripe for the taking. The Volstead Act had made alcohol illegal, but Prohibition only created a golden opportunity for those bold enough to exploit it. Speakeasies flourished, politicians were easily bought, and law enforcement looked the other way for the right price. Into this chaos stepped Al Capone, a young and ambitious man eager to make his mark. Johnny Torrio, his mentor, had built a sophisticated bootlegging empire, smuggling whiskey from Canada, bribing officials, and ensuring that every bar, club, and restaurant in the city had a steady supply of alcohol. Capone started as Torrio's enforcer, a trusted lieutenant responsible for overseeing the money flow and dealing with anyone who stood in their way. But Capone wasn't just muscle. He was strategic, a man who understood both violence and the power of appearances. As Torrio's right hand, Capone quickly learned that success in the underworld wasn't just about brute force. It was about controlling people. His charm and street smarts made him a natural leader, earning respect from gangsters, politicians, and even members of high society. Unlike other criminals, Capone wasn't content with lurking in the shadows. He wanted to be seen. He attended the opera, sponsored charity events, and made generous donations to the community, all while running one of the deadliest criminal organizations in America. To the public, he was a larger-than-life figure, a modern-day Robin Hood. To his enemies, he was ruthless. Everything changed in 1925 when Johnny Torrio was ambushed and nearly assassinated by a rival gang. He survived, but barely. Wounded and shaken, he saw an opportunity to retire while he was still alive. And so, in a move that stunned even those closest to him, Torrio handed over the entire empire to Al Capone, just 26 years old at the time. Overnight, Capone became the most powerful gangster in Chicago. He wasted no time in expanding the empire, making more money than ever before. Bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and extortion were all under his control, bringing in an estimated $100 million per year, an astronomical sum at the time. But with power came responsibility, and Capone had no patience for disloyalty or weakness. His rule was built on fear and respect. He personally ordered the executions of rival gang members, corrupt cops who failed him, and even former allies who had outlived their usefulness. In one infamous case, he invited 3 men suspected of plotting against him to a banquet, where he wined and dined them before beating them to death with a baseball bat in front of his men. This was how Capone ensured loyalty, not just through money, but through sheer, brutal dominance. Yet, despite his violent reputation, he carefully maintained his public image as a businessman. He dressed in custom-made suits, drove expensive cars, and made sure to be photographed shaking hands with important people. To those who benefited from his rule, he was a protector. To those who crossed him, he was a death sentence. But even a man like Capone had his limits. He had made too many enemies, gained too much attention, and with each murder, with each bribe, with each power grab, he edged closer to his inevitable downfall. The city was his, but the storm was already brewing, and the bloodiest event of his career was yet to come. By the late 1920s, Al Capone was at the height of his empire. He controlled Chicago with an iron grip, making millions each. Through bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and extortion. His reach extended far beyond the underworld. Police officers, judges, and even politicians were in his pocket, ensuring that his operations ran smoothly. But power always breeds enemies, and none were more dangerous than George "Bugs" Moran, the last major threat to Capone's total domination. Moran led the North Side Gang, a fierce rival to Capone's syndicate, and their turf wars had already spilled gallons of blood onto the streets of Chicago. Capone knew that as long as Moran was alive, he could never claim absolute control. So he devised a plan so brutal, so calculated, that it would send a chilling message to anyone who dared oppose him. February 14, 1929, started like any other day, cold and quiet, but by noon it would become a date etched in crime history. Capone was in Florida, ensuring he had an airtight alibi while his men set the trap in Chicago. A group of his enforcers, dressed as police officers, arrived at a warehouse on North Clark Street, a known hideout for Moran's men. Seeing what they thought were officers conducting a raid, the gangsters inside surrendered without resistance, expecting to be taken into custody. Instead, they were lined up against a brick wall. Then, without hesitation, the officers pulled out Thompson's submachine guns and opened fire, unleashing a barrage of bullets that tore through flesh and bone. The attack was swift, efficient, and merciless. 7 men were executed in cold blood, their bodies crumpling to the ground in pools of their own blood. It was a massacre, the kind that even Chicago, accustomed to gangland killings, had never seen before. But the real target, Bugs Moran, had unknowingly escaped. He had arrived late and spotted the fake police officers outside, deciding to turn away before he walked into the slaughter. The news of the St. Valentine's Day massacre spread like wildfire, shocking the nation. The sheer brutality and precision of the killings sent an undeniable message. Capone was untouchable, and anyone who challenged him would meet the same fate. But while the massacre cemented his rule, it also marked the beginning of his downfall. For years, Capone had operated in a space where law enforcement either feared him or were paid off to look the other way. But this was different. The public, once captivated by the legend of Capone as a businessman, turned against him. Pressure mounted on authorities to bring him down, and the FBI began to take a deeper interest in his affairs. The massacre had also created unintended consequences. The crime scene was too perfect, too staged. It didn't look like a typical gangland shooting, and people began asking the right questions. The press ran with the story, publishing photographs of the bloodied corpses in newspapers across America, turning Capone from a feared kingpin into a national villain. He had ruled Chicago with a mix of charisma and terror, but now the terror was all that remained. The walls were closing in. Capone's enemies were dead or in hiding, but the greatest threat he would ever face wasn't another gangster. It was the United States government. The St. Valentine's Day massacre had made Al Capone infamous not just in Chicago, but across the entire country. For years, he had operated above the law, buying off police, judges, and politicians, ensuring that his empire remained untouchable. But the massacre had crossed a line. The public was horrified, and the government, under mounting pressure, could no longer ignore the blood-soaked reality of Capone's reign. He had killed rivals before, but this time it wasn't just a gangland feud, it was a national scandal. The city that once turned a blind eye to his crimes now demanded his downfall. Yet catching Capone was easier said than done. He was careful, never directly involved in violent acts, never leaving behind evidence that could tie him to a crime. He had an army of lawyers who kept him shielded from prosecution, and every time the police tried to pin something on him, witnesses mysteriously disappeared or changed their testimony. It was clear that traditional law enforcement methods wouldn't work. Enter Elliot Ness, a young and determined federal agent with a simple mission: bring down Al Capone. Unlike the corrupt officers Capone had on his payroll, Ness and his hand-picked team, known as the Untouchables, couldn't be bribed. They launched relentless raids on Capone's operations, shutting down breweries and speakeasies, seizing illegal alcohol shipments, and making it harder for his empire to function. But Capone wasn't just a bootlegger. He was a criminal mastermind who always found new ways to keep the money flowing. Ness's attacks were annoying, but they weren't enough to put him behind bars. That's when the government realized they were looking in the wrong place. They didn't need to prove murder or racketeering. They just needed to follow the money. Capone had been making millions every year, but he never filed a legitimate tax return. He lived in luxury, custom suits, diamond jewelry, expensive cars, and lavish parties. Yet, on paper, he had no real income. The Treasury Department, led by investigator Frank J. Wilson, began building a case against him not for his countless murders, not for his smuggling empire, but for tax evasion. It was almost laughable. A man who had ruled Chicago through fear and violence was about to be taken down by something as mundane as unpaid taxes. In 1931, Capone was formally charged with 22 counts of tax evasion and, in a shocking turn of events, was denied bail. His arrogance, once his greatest weapon, became his downfall. Believing he could bribe his way out as he always had, he was caught off guard when the government presented solid evidence: ledgers, witness testimonies, and undeniable proof that he had made and hidden millions. His lawyers tried to negotiate, offering a plea deal in exchange for a light sentence, but the judge refused. The trial was brutal, with Capone trying to intimidate jurors, only for the judge to replace the jury at the last moment, ensuring an honest verdict. On October 17, 1931, Al Capone was found guilty and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the longest tax evasion sentence in U.S. history at the time. It was a humiliating defeat. The man who had once commanded an empire, who had politicians at his beck and call, who had built an image of invincibility, was now just another convicted felon. At first, he was sent to a prison in Atlanta, but even behind bars, his influence remained. He bribed guards, received special privileges, and continued to run his operations from his cell. But in 1934, everything changed. The government decided that if they truly wanted to break him, they had to strip him of his power completely. And so, he was transferred to Alcatraz, the cold, isolated fortress in the middle of the San Francisco Bay, a place designed to hold the worst of the worst. Here, there were no bribes, no connections, no favors. Just concrete walls, freezing waters, and the crushing reality that he was no longer the king of Chicago. For the first time in his life, Al Capone was truly powerless. And even worse, something far deadlier than the government had already begun eating away at him from the inside.